Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about the incredible power the Ring of Fire has had over the evolution of humankind. Today's script was penned by Dustin Koski, and his Twitter profile will be provided alongside links to my storytelling channel, Story Rant, and my link tree to my socials and books. With that said, let's get started. At 24,900 miles, if the array of volcanoes known as the Ring of Fire were stretched out straight, it would encircle the Earth. Instead, it spans from New Zealand, around Malaysia and Indonesia, up through the Philippines, to mainland Asia, and from there to Japan. Then further up to the Kamchatka Peninsula of eastern Russia, across the Aleutian Islands to Alaska. Then down the western coasts of North and South America, ending in Argentina and Chile. It's more like the Horseshoe of Fire, with the two tips of the horseshoe situated about 5,800 miles apart. This is fitting for how it has served as the cavalry bringing the inferno of hell onto the Earth. So let's go on a ride around this geographic marvel. Along our tour, we'll be moving through time and space. We'll see the origin of this titanic terrain of tectonic tumult through to the underappreciated ways it has shaped modern civilization. We'll make stops to study particularly notable volcanoes and their most memorable eruptions, particularly if you happen to be around at the time. Then it'll be time to be nimble on your feet as we go through the stories of earthquakes that are spine-chilling to contemplate, let alone experience. Now, try not to fall into the burning ring of fire even as the earth shakes and the flames go up higher. As with many geographic features of the Earth's surface, the Ring of Fire is the result of tectonic plates floating on a layer of magma, bumping and grinding, and I'll add, subducting. In this case, it's a matter of all the smaller plates ganging up on the biggest one. That biggest one is the Pacific Plate, and at 102 million square miles, it's more than double the size of the second largest, the South American Plate. It moves westward at a rate of 5 to 10 centimeters annually, and that puts it in conflict with the North American Plate, Caribbean Plate, primarily along Mexico's west coast, and Nazca Plate of South America. The Antarctic Plate to the south has proved less problematic, hence the horseshoe shape of the Ring of Fire. To the east, the Ring of Fire rubs against the Australian Plate, Filipina Plate, and Eurasian Plate. The Eurasian Plate's conflict with the Pacific Plate is particularly eventful as the islands of Japan are located along that border. The location is known as a convergent plate boundary. As anyone who has tried to push against a flat object from opposite sides at once has found, a section of the Earth's crust doesn't have to be along the outer edges of the Pacific Plate to become a seismic hotspot. For example, the notoriously volcanic Hawaiian Islands are located at the center of the Pacific Plate and are a result of a massive tectonic pressure causing surface subduction, leading to fissures that release magma. Despite being a result of the same tectonic phenomena, the Hawaiian Islands are not generally recognized as members of the Ring of Fire, except maybe as honorary members. So now that the literal groundwork has been laid, just how many natural disasters does the tectonic activity of the Ring of Fire inflict on the world? Well, for starters, roughly 80 to 90% of the world's earthquakes occur around it. That amounts to roughly 1,500 earthquakes annually, of which roughly 100 are severe enough to cause significant damage. The next most active area, the Alpide Belt, which runs from Gibraltar to Malaysia, gets only about 17%. For those more interested in the fire aspect of the ring, there are 452 potentially active volcanoes in that semicircle. Of those, roughly 37 erupt a year on land. That's about 75% of the volcanic activity on Earth. They're particularly concentrated in Indonesia, which has 55 of them. Japan brings 40 to the geographic table. The United States of America offers up 39 of those in the ring, 27 of them in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. New Zealand might not seem like such a big contributor since it only provides 10 of them, but considering that all New Zealand volcanoes are active ones, it makes up for numbers with energy. For those curious, there is no comparable Atlantic Ring of Fire. There is Iceland with its 32 volcanoes as it sits along the mid-Atlantic volcanic ridge, but no ring. This may change in the future, but since geologists estimate that it would take about 20 million years, it's fair to say the Pacific Ring of Fire is a more pressing concern. Despite the propensity for earthquakes and eruptions seeming like conditions that would not be very hospitable to human settlement, something will become evident after a quick analysis. A gigantic number of people live along the Ring of Fire. Most of Indonesia's 270 million people, the 100 million of the Philippines, 53 million Americans, particularly in California, the most populous state, and many of China's 1.2 billion live in the Ring of Fire. This has put a lot of people in a more precarious situation than many may realize. For example, 20 million people are threatened by the active volcano Popocatépetl near Mexico City alone. A reported 800 million live within 60 miles of an active volcano. To get an idea how close that would be in the event of a major eruption, when Mount St. Helens in southwestern Washington state famously erupted in 1980, it sent out a destructive blast with a radius of more than 19 miles. As we'll see all too clearly, a person doesn't need to be within that area to be killed by an eruption. This population density in a relatively dangerous area is because the tectonic activity is a blessing along with a curse. The ash released by those hundreds of volcanoes doing their thing only covers roughly 1% of the Earth's surface, but it massively enriches the soil. In 2014, a single eruption of Indonesia's Mount Sinabung released ash that was estimated to serve as the nutritive equivalent of 10 million tons of fertilizer, meaning that, for a time at least, the area boasted literally the most fertile soil in the world. Not immediately, of course. The Department of Life Science and Agriculture of Ecuador reports that it takes roughly 2 to 4 years for volcanic ash to enrich soil. So it's cold comfort for those who recently endured the effects of a particularly severe eruption. While China's soil has clearly benefited greatly from the ash provided by the 30 volcanoes it contributes to the Ring of Fire, its short-term peace and stability has often suffered greatly from them. In a November 2021 article in Nature, an analysis found that if there were major volcanic activity within a few years, the ruling dynasty in China would be out of power. That might sound like soothsaying, but the causes are purely secular. Volcanic eruptions not only introduce ash, which in the short term lower temperatures and thus disrupt growing seasons, they often reduce evaporation over large bodies of water and thus bring droughts with them. With food scarcity comes lack of approval for the ruling party, and desperation motivates rebels. Case studies included the falls of the Ming dynasty in 945 AD, the Liao dynasty in 1125 AD, and the Ming dynasty in 1644. The Ming and Liao were particularly revealing for being preceded by periods of stability prior to the volcanic activity, and the Ming dynasty's fall was notable for there being a specific eruption to point to, that of the volcano now known as Mount Parker in the Philippines. While this phenomenon is particularly studied in China, it's not unique to it. A massive eruption in 626 AD was attributed with bringing down the Eastern Turkish Empire. However, other than taking place in the extratropical northern hemisphere, the location of that volcano is unknown, so it's not clear if that should be blamed on or credited to the Ring of Fire. There is one volcano where the impact its eruptions have had on humanity is much clearer. As has been mentioned before on Geographics, in 1883 the most famous eruption in the history of the Ring of Fire occurred on August 27th. On that day, Mount Krakatoa, located in the Sunda Strait between the Java and Sumatra Island in Indonesia, erupted with such power that the boom circled the world 4 times. It was reported to have been the first event every person on Earth directly experienced through their physical senses, as well as documented at the time due to the recent mass adoption of the telegraph. It changed the atmospheric conditions for years after, exacerbating winters. One immortalized result were the vivid sunsets of the time period, such as Edward Munch depicted in his iconic The Scream painting. Closer to home, it resulted in numerous tsunamis and left 36,000 corpses in its wake. Less well known is the impact it had on religious relations in the region. In 1883, Indonesia was still a Dutch colonial power, and while there had been a large Muslim population since the 14th century, it was a fairly amenable presence to European powers. Mount Krakatoa's 36,000 dead left many wondering why such a cruel calamity befell them, and many were desperate enough to listen to anyone who could present themselves as an authority figure. Fundamentalist Muslims took advantage and said that the eruption had been brought about as punishment for allowing Dutch rule of the region. The message resonated so strongly that the 1888 Baton Peasants' Revolt was a direct result. It would ultimately be unsuccessful, but it planted the seeds for revolution against colonial rulers, which would result in Indonesian independence in 1949, and set Indonesia on the path to being a major Muslim nation, ironically except in the province of Rakata, which contains Mount Krakatoa. Also majorly overlooked about Mount Krakatoa for the longest time is that it has recently become a prime suspect in the murder of the Western Roman Empire. As reported in Nature magazine in July 2015, 2 major volcanic eruptions occurred in 535 AD, one of which was suspected to be Mount Krakatoa. As in 1883, the vast eruption pumped such large amounts of ash into the air that it exacerbated winters in temperate regions for years after. This set the stage for the Justinian plague, which gutted the empire, to be as severe as it was, and by some accounts led to the societal shifts that were long known as the Dark Ages, that led to the decentralization of Christian authority and the rise of nation-states. Thus, science, history, and religion converge explosively and allow new worlds to rise from ashes. As impactful as Krakatoa has been for human civilization, it's not alone among Indonesian volcanoes for having a global effect. One of the most famous examples took place in April 1815. On April 5th, ominous signs began to spring up around Mount Tambora, a volcano 2 miles tall, at the time located on the 6,000 square miles Sumbawa Island, the 10th largest in Indonesia. The seismic activity came to a head on April 10th with an eruption that ultimately put 36 cubic miles of ash in the atmosphere. It was the largest eruption in recorded history, exceeding that of Krakatoa 10 times over. The eruption itself took the lives of 10,000 people directly. It was so devastating that it inflicted severe damage on the stone of the volcano itself, leaving the volcano only about 2/3 of its original height, with a crater 3 miles wide as a memento. The worst came over time. The 36 miles of cubic ash lingered in the upper atmosphere and dropped average global temperatures about 5 degrees during 1816. In China, this compelled many to switch from food to opium production, leading to massive addictions that characterized what became known as the Century of Humiliation. Over in the United States of America, it led to crop failures that compelled many Americans to move from East Coast states into what became the Heartland. One particularly noteworthy family affected by this was that of Abraham Lincoln, who left their Kentucky home for Indiana and thus moved Lincoln into the region where he would reach the turning point of his political career. Worst of all was likely India, where weakened immune systems caused the population to be devastated by cholera outbreaks. What became known as the Year Without Summer would be estimated to have caused 80,000 excess deaths in Indonesia alone. It took several years for the ash to dissipate before the temperatures returned to normal. Mount Tambora is still active. Whether it will ever repeat this remains to be seen, but there have been smaller eruptions and bursts of seismic activity as recently as 2013. The ability for Ring of Fire eruptions to have global impact has been well established, and it was only a matter of time before South America got in on the fun. The single most momentous instance of this began on February 18th, 1600. On that day, Huayna Patina, otherwise known as New Volcano, located in Peru's central Andes region, began the largest recorded eruption in South American history. It was so severe that it blocked the sun until March 5th. It killed a reported 1,500 people in the region. There was considerable animosity among the Incas, as the practice of human sacrifice to prevent such eruptions had been recently banned by their Spanish conquerors. Unlike the wave of religious fundamentalism resulting from the Mount Krakatoa eruption, Huayna Patina's eruption reportedly caused a huge drop in donations to the church for the region. Perhaps local Christians thought the Incas might have been onto something with those sacrifices after all. Regions around the globe consistently recorded horrible effects from this eruption. In China, Korea, and Japan, harvests were late while lakes froze earlier than ever previously recorded, and the dietary disruption resulted in epidemics. In Europe, there were several years of record-breaking cold winters and snowfalls. Wine industries were completely ruined in France and Germany, cruelly destroying a primary coping mechanism for the problem. Most severely impacted of all was unquestionably Russia. Not only were 1601 to 1603 the years of Russia's worst famine in recorded history, the resulting riots led to the overthrow of the Tsar himself. The Ring of Fire makes vividly clear just how much more human history is controlled by material conditions than by ideology and philosophy. If you were keeping up on current events at all in 1991, you probably heard all about Mount Pinatubo's eruption on June 15th, the second largest eruption of the 20th century and easily the most devastating. It threw enough ash up to 28 miles into the air that it spread to an average depth of 2 inches for more than 1,500 square miles of Luzon, the largest island of the Philippines archipelago. It almost knocked 17 commercial airlines out of the sky, causing more than $100 million in damage to planes alone. To make matters even worse, it was followed in short order by a typhoon. In fact, it was the typhoon which caused the most deaths by soaking the ash so that it became heavy enough to collapse roofs, raising the death toll to 722. And yet, the Pinatubo eruption was, to a significant extent, a triumph in the field of applied science. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology in the U.S. Geological Survey had anticipated the eruption for months, and many Filipinos evacuated well in advance, while the U.S. Navy was able to launch Operation Fiery Vigil with speed that otherwise would have been unheard of. Vessels, including the aircraft carrier the USS Abraham Lincoln, evacuated 20,000 people from harm's way, the largest U.S. military evacuation since South Vietnam in 1975. Such was the hasty nature of the evacuation that program manager John Murray recounted how one newlywed from an arranged marriage got separated from her husband, and she knew him so little that she could only tell the military personnel that she was looking for Ricky. Nonetheless, an estimated 5,000 lives were saved, and many people were left to consider the prospect of heroic geologists for the first time in their lives. It imbued the generally humble profession of geology with an unusual degree of heroism, inspiring the greenlighting of rival volcano movies Dante's Peak and Volcano in 1997. As a side note, Volcano scared the crap out of me. No, Dante's Peak. They both did. I was terrified of volcanoes as a kid because of those movies, but Dante's Peak freaked me out more because Pierce Brosnan has a moment where he has like a compound fracture in his leg and the bone is showing out of his knee, and I felt like phantom pain in my knees as a child going home from the movie theater that day. While most of the runtime of this video has been devoted to volcanic activity in the Ring of Fire, it would not do to ignore the impacts of earthquakes, such as we did with our video devoted to the 2011 earthquake off the coast of Japan, which led to the Fukushima disaster. To that end, Alaska is not associated with chaos or turmoil in general. Nonetheless, on March 27, 1964, a massive collision between the Pacific Plate and the Northern American Plate would turn Alaska into the most cacophonous place in the world. The entire North American Plate along the Alaskan continental shelf was raised 9 meters, which resulted in an epicenter 75 miles east of Anchorage, Alaska, which reached 9.2 on the Richter scale. The shock would destroy 30 blocks of buildings and launch tsunamis 220 feet high at Alaska's Valdez Inlet. Nancy Bidwell, an Anchorage resident who was a high school senior living in the Turnagain Heights neighborhood, reported such massive ground movement that the soil resembled rolling waves on the ocean. She also said that a massive birch in her home's yard canted left and right through her field of view, like it was walking. Even in Louisiana, there were reported to be puddles sloshing from the earthquake. Despite the severe force of the disaster, the death count would be extremely low compared to disasters across the sea. There were 139 lives lost, all but 15 of them the result of the waves and flooding instead of the direct force of the quakes. Yet, the trauma for the state was sufficient that Palmer, Alaska became the headquarters for the National Tsunami Warning Center, which otherwise would be quite surprising considering how Alaska is about 500 miles at least from the rest of continental America's west coast. Still, it gets worse from there. Since there have been machines to measure them, earthquakes have never roiled human populations with a force that struck along the coast of Chile on May 22, 1960. On that horrible day, a section of the border of the South American plate more than 300 miles long slid several meters beneath the Pacific plate. It produced an unprecedented 9.5 on the Richter scale. It was more than half a point higher than the next highest, which had struck Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula in 1952. Over the course of only 10 minutes, it shifted the geography of Chile by a measurable degree, expanding the coastal nation by the equivalent of 1,500 football fields. This produced tsunamis which easily topped out over 80 feet. The closest city struck was Valdivia, which became the namesake of the earthquake. One survivor of the disaster was Sergio Barrientos. As he described his ordeal in 2016, his hometown moved 30 feet to the west in a minute. Telephone lines would swing across the street to strike each other. Perhaps it was to be expected that Barrientos went on to become the director of the National Seismological Center at the University of Chile, Santiago. He was fortunate that he did not live in Porto Saavedra, which was not only completely destroyed, but its remains were carried miles inland. The power of the Valdivia quake was felt throughout the Pacific with deadly effect. Up in Hawaii, 12 hours after the quake began, the town of Hilo was hit by waves more than 30 feet high. 61 people were drowned by them. Over in Japan, the island of Honshu, the largest of the 4 main islands, waves around 20 feet tall struck and destroyed over 1,600 buildings while leaving 185 dead. The 32 lives lost in the Philippines seem almost light in comparison. In addition to the total of 1,655 who lost their lives, nearly 2 million people were left homeless. Bear in mind that it was said to have potentially been much worse, as many buildings in the affected regions were built to be earthquake resistant. An eruption occurred in the Pueu volcano 3 days after the quake and shot plumes that climbed over a mile in the air for weeks and must have felt like rubbing ash in the wound. The Ring of Fire is one of the clearest demonstrations of the duality of nature in regards to humankind. It has nurtured the growth of some of humanity's most powerful and enduring empires by providing nutritious soil, while also providing many of its greatest tragedies. While earthquakes and eruptions are unpredictable, there are ominous signs, such as a newly rapidly emergent Nishinoshima Island volcano 600 miles south of Tokyo. All we people can do is enjoy the bounty that has been provided until its wrath is felt again. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video and found it to be informative. If you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and be sure to follow Dustin and myself with the links provided in the description below. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.